Nobel Peace Prize winner Desmond Tutu explains how love and forgiveness kept post-apartheid South Africa from tumbling into anarchy.
Despite all appearances to the contrary, it is a moral universe that in the end, good prevails. Segregation was a key aspect of our lives. You knew, that there were some who were in and the others were out. You had these separate exits, but then you went onto the same street and you breathed the same air. And it was crazy, but a lot of it was humiliating. You were human, but you were not quite as human as the others.
We are saying no to evil. No to evil. We say yes to goodness. Yes.
Very many good things have happened. One is we're free. It was quite unbelievable how quickly it happened. It was, as they sometimes say, like greased lightning. One day, Nelson Mandela is in jail, the next he is out. Then you have negotiations, and hey presto, we have a democracy.
But I and the ANC are as opposed to black domination as we are to white domination.
Imagine if we had chosen the path of retribution and revenge. Our country would have been dust and ashes now.
Desmond Tutu there speaking. And earlier we did ask you these in our Twitter poll. What is your wish for the continent on this Africa Day? We wanted to know your wish for the continent on this Africa Day. It's a day that is marked every 25th of May across the world, not just in the continent. We'd like to hear your feedback on that. Now to just tell us more about this Africa Day, what it's all about, how it even started. We have my colleague Fatia Mohamed Nuru is on the other end of the studio, and she's ready to tell us exactly that. Fatia, good evening.
Of course, a very good evening to you. Yes, Yusuf, yes, we want to just tell you about what the African Day is all about. Now, first off, the Africa Day is celebrated every year on May 25th. It is the first union of African countries on the African soil, and basically is the foundation of the Organization of the African Unity, OAU, that was formed in 1963, basically to enhance unity, promote countries politically and economically. After that, though, the Organization of Africa Unity was changed to the African Union in 2001 to basically just give it an African feel. And then in 2002, it was officially formed by Thabo Mbeki in South Africa, Durban. Now, you'd want to know what is the importance of this day. First things first, reaching back to your roots. Basically, as an African, we have a very rich heritage. So it just takes you back to where you came from to understand where you are from. Secondly, promoting peace and harmony and stability among member states. You do know very well there are some countries in Africa that are not very stable, like Somalia and South Sudan. Third, empowering Africa's youth. Well, basically, there are so many youths right now in Africa compared to different parts of the world. Africa is actually one of the continents with many, many youths. Now, on the next Super Bowl here, we want to understand the Africa key milestones that Africa has done from independence. Now, one, politically free. Politically free basically means that all the African countries are independent. You can remember that South Sudan is the youngest nation. It got its independence in 2011. Secondly, the largest mineral industries in the world. That basically means that Africa has the biggest industries in the world. For example, Botswana has 35% of diamond. South Africa has diamond, gold, and all that. And you'd be surprised that DRC has a capacity of $24 trillion when it comes to mineral resources. Now, third, a free trade area pact that was just signed a few months few months back, basically just to give the regional areas a free trade area so that they can trade easily, to enhance profitability and efficiency in trade in each of those countries. Now, there are 25 Nobel Prize winners in Africa. The first one, though, is Max Theatel from South Africa. He's a white South African, but he won the Nobel Prize in 1951. And of course, you have other prize winners like the late Wangari Maathai, Desmond Tutu, Kofi Annan, among others. Finally, we have two UN Secretary Generals. That is Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, and Boutros Ghali from Egypt. Those are just some of the key milestones that Africa has made, but tomorrow we'll be marking the Africa Day. Yusuf, back to you.
Thank you very much, Fatia Mohamedou, for that explanation. We really appreciate. And in studio, to kickstart our debate, first of all, let me reintroduce our guest once again. We have Peter Biarajak, who is the chairman, South Sudan Young Leaders Forum, also executive director, Center for Strategic Analysis and Research in Juba. Mark Bichachi is a political communication strategist and also a regional affairs analyst. And good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. See you again.
Yeah, Peter, let me begin with you. There's something Fatia mentioned there about, our forefathers having a vision of, having peace and harmony in this continent. And just yesterday, the South Sudan peace talks collapsed in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. There was no any kind of tangible agreement that came out of that talks. First of all, let me begin with this. What is your reaction to that?
Well, it's very disappointing to say the very least that our political leaders have been unable to reach peace despite many rounds of talks. We knew before this final round, because it was a round that kept on being postponed. It was originally scheduled to take place much earlier, but then it couldn't take place. And each time it appeared as if it was going to take place, it kept on being delayed. So it was very clear that there were huge gaps that still existed between the parties, which basically signaled that the parties in South Sudan are not ready at the time to negotiate an agreement that can actually end the violence. So what IGAD has proposed now is what it saw as a middle ground, and is essentially recycling of what existed before, which didn't work when it was tried again in 2016. This is what is being proposed again. And this is essentially not going to work. And now, things are even bad for South Sudan. The economy is doing very bad. As you know very well, the inflation is among the highest in the world. Right now, the government is essentially broke. They can't pay salaries. They've been going for a month without paying the salaries of the military. And they cannot pay for anything else. So essentially, it's a very bad time. And they're proposing a very large government with 3 vice presidents, with like 42 cabinet ministers, 440 MPs, essentially putting every single warlord and anybody else that is there creating a political party on a payroll at a cabinet level, or a level of a member of parliament, or a level of a senior general in the country.
Now, of course, what happened yesterday was a disappointment, not just for South Sudanese, but of course the continent, Africa itself. Now, Mark, using South Sudan as an example, is it fair to say that Africa has failed, in realizing the vision our forefathers had of, promoting peace and unity in this continent? And it's not just South Sudan. There are also problems in Central Africa, Republic, Somalia. The examples are so many.
Well, it can be imagined based on our news cycles in Africa that Africa does have indeed many examples of warring nations or nations in conflict. But if you were to put the 50-plus states of Africa and consider how many of them are in any form of violence, you realize that it's less than 10%, which is a vast difference between this same continent 20, 25 years ago, where there was conflict almost in every other country. So Africa has made great strides in stabilizing itself. And I would like to underscore stabilizing itself. Let's remember that even the Kenyan troops were used in stabilizing many West African countries. So Africa has succeeded in putting itself together. Let's not forget that There was a president who refused to get out of office after losing an election, and it was African countries that installed the duly elected leader, and this is just 2 years ago. So the reality of the matter is Africa has made great strides towards stabilizing itself. And let's not forget that if you were to compare Africa with South America, which is caught in the doldrums of corruption and the drug war, you'd realize that Africa is safer than Venezuela, for example. It's safer than Colombia. It's safer than very many countries across the world. And let's understand that there is no place on Africa in the entire continent that can be compared to Syria. So is Africa doing much better? It is. But that does not mean we should ignore places like Somalia, places like the Central African Republic, places like Burundi, and indeed,
of course
South Sudan. Yes.
And Peter, Mark says Africa has made great strides when it comes to this conversation that we are having about peace and harmony in this continent. From a South Sudanese point of view, do you think you're getting enough support from Africa, to be specific, organs like the African Union? Because I believe even the talks yesterday were being mediated by the IGAD, not the African Union.
Well, I think it's very important, especially on a day like this, the Africa Day, to first of all remember what was the kind of ideals that the black people of the time and the great thinkers of the time that established the first African countries were thinking about. This was really a revolutionary. It was a very daring dream to think that black people can free themselves after many, many, many years of basically being ruled by European colonialists. And let's not forget also what was going on in America at that time, especially segregation. And the ideas that led to these kind of dreams that led to Africa Day being created, OAU being created, it was essentially to liberate black people. And this was essentially a beginning of a thinking of what liberation means. Liberation means, first of all, like taking the tools yourself so that you are able to then improve your welfare. So essentially the idea back then was, if you get this white guy off your back that was holding you back, and you let the citizens of the land take over now and actually run the countries, then you will perform extremely well. There was a great ideas that were defined about Africa discovering itself and discovering its position on global scale. If you look currently, there is a mirage. And indeed, if you want to use a very low standards and only focus about stabilization, but what about if you focus about opportunity? What is going on in Africa? If you look at what is the scenes of what is happening in Libya with black people being sold on African continent, essentially slavery being repeated. If you look essentially what is happening in South Sudan, the same thing. The idea was that North Sudanese were sitting on our back. And we as South Sudanese, if we take over, if we let our own sons and daughters take over, then they will be able to help our people realize their full potential. But since our own government took over since 2005, and despite a large number of oil revenues, if you look at the priorities they chose to spend the money, it's nothing related whatsoever with actually allowing the people to realize their full potential. And this is essentially...
Yes, Peter, especially bearing that South Sudan had only 2 years of relative calm since they attained independence. After that, it has always been a chaos. Now, Mark, as we close our chapter on South Sudan, what do you think should be the end game here? Because this is almost becoming a tired topic.
South Sudan is a complicated country, and the desires of Riek Machar and Salva Kiir can be squarely located in the areas which have oil, and that's really what the fight is about. The fight is about wealth. It's not about the South Sudanese people. It's not about their access to opportunity. It's not about the equalization of the country. It's not even about the development of the country. And therefore, the solution, the only solution that can be reached, is if there is not a power-sharing agreement, but a revenue-sharing agreement around those oil fields. That's really where the problem is. And that's largely the problem in Africa, that we cannot agree on how to equally distribute the resources that Mother Nature has bestowed upon us to be able to be distributed. So that's the first part, that we must understand that this is a financial fight, and if it's a financial fight, peace can only be achieved if we find out a formula of sharing that revenue. Well
said, Mark, there. Now let's talk about the need to empower African youth. I believe this is one of the theme in previous African Day commemorations. Now, Peter, according to the United Nations, 10 of the world's youngest nations are in Africa, but still there's a huge gap between the youth and those in leadership. For example, 79% of Ugandans were born after Museveni took power back in the year 1986. In Zimbabwe, 85% of Zimbabweans were born after Mugabe took power back in the 1980s. At least he's out of power now. And 85% of Angolans were not born when Dos Santos came into power in 1979. But Peter, we've seen a lot of changes in leadership in Africa, starting from South Africa, Ethiopia, Botswana. I mean, there are a lot of examples. Do you think there's need for the youth in Africa to remain hopeful that things might be better now, moving forward?
I think so. I think what we have been able to see so far in the places that you mentioned is quite encouraging, especially what is going on in South Africa with Julius Malema and others. Quite encouraging about what young people can actually do. And I think there are more young people that are coming up. I know very well in Chad and other places, there are young people that are coming up that are trying to engage in the larger civic discussions about the kind of state that African governments should craft. But you see, this is not something to be taken for granted. It's something that requires sacrifice and persistence participation. It requires young people taking risks and essentially realizing that they themselves need to be part of the conversation and be in the centers of where the decisions are being made. And for them to be able to do that will require them mobilizing and talking to other young people. And this is essentially what is needed, because many African countries, they exist as countries. Yes, they meet the basic characteristic. But if you look about shared vision, shared ideals, shared future for that people, it usually doesn't exist. And you find essentially government being defined as this other, where you need to mobilize yourself and your clan and your tribe to be able to loot it. And essentially, when you look at it from that perspective, it becomes a different game, rather one that is driven by interest and desire of groups like youth and how they see themselves and their future. So I do believe what is going on in the countries you mentioned is encouraging, but African youth need to participate in politics. They need to vote. They need to run for office. They need to organize political parties. This is essentially what is needed across Africa, because young people in Africa are the majority. In South Sudan, you have essentially 95% of population being under the age of 45. And this is the group that we are trying to target in South Sudan Young Leaders Forum to be able to be active so that they come together, talk to the youth, put down the weapon, and together help build the kind of South Sudan that they want to forge. And
well said, Peter. Now, Mark, Peter is a bit optimistic there. What do you have to say about this? Because youth in leadership, this is a debate people have had several, people have been talking about this almost everywhere. Is Africa finally on the right track?
I am one of those people who do not believe that youth is necessarily an advantage and the numbers of youth is anything to be considered, for as long as the youth have the worst poverty of all, which is the poverty of ideas. What is different about this generation of youth is, whereas we had the Marxists and the rightists and the leftists in previous generations of young people, what we are seeing in the current generation of young people, which my colleague has alluded to, is the inability to participate in the creation of their own future. Not because they've not been given positions, but because they've bankrupted themselves of the ideas and the thought leadership that is supposed to be available to spur them into the future. Africa is a continent indeed. It is the youngest continent in the world. It has the youngest population. It has the most able-bodied population in the world. But what these young people lack is a galvanizing ideology. When Kwame Nkrumah came into power, he came in with Pan-Africanism. Today, that is a word which most African youth do not understand. We do not stand on either side of the political divide. We do not have a political debate as a young people, and the disease that is going to crop across Africa is going to be the disease we've borrowed from America called consumerism, where the young people are obsessed with the acquisition acquisition of wealth without the necessary acquisition of culture and etiquette and finesse that is required to build a society upon which the future can stand. So today I can tell you the truth. If the youth generation continues like this, and I'm including myself in that if we continue like this, then Africa does not have hope merely by including the youth in our parliaments and in our positions of power. We must foster within the youth ideas.
And Mark, speaking about poverty of ideas, I believe you've seen a story from the US yesterday of a 30-year-old man who was literally forced by his parents to go out of their house. I mean, that also shows that there are people who are not willing to go out there and, do what is necessary. Now, speaking about poverty, Peter, there's some statistics here I have for you. 1 in every 2 people apparently in extreme poverty in the world live in Africa. There is about 400 to 500 million people. 20 million people still face starvation. I mean, this is a debate that we shouldn't have at this age, right?
Absolutely. And by the way, it's very interesting to kind of juxtapose that to the World Bank strategy of ending poverty by 2030. If essentially that is the statistics, then when the rest of the world has got out of poverty, all the poor people in the world will only be living in Africa. And if you look, the driving reason why that is the case is essentially because of conflict, is fragility. And you see, we were talking before about the great ideas about what our forefathers were imagining when they're creating that state. And I have to say, for South Sudanese, these are the generation that are creating this state. The South Sudanese of today are just like the Africans of the 1960s. And this is a great opportunity that my people in South Sudan must realize, that we have this ability to create this state. And this requires civic participation in the right way, not in a way in which we destroy the state, but in the way in which we question those who are entrusted with the affairs of the state, what they are doing to make things better, to help us realize the ideals for which we fought for the struggle. It's a legitimate question to be asked, but we have to do it in the right way. So people of South Sudan has this great opportunity to kind of reawaken the African dream, the African idea. And it's very essential, especially on this day, today and tomorrow. We have a summit that is being organized by Crisis Action. South Sudan is basically solidarity with South Sudan to kind of share these great ideals of Africa with this young nation of South Sudan, because this country has the potential to help the rest of Africa to rediscover that kind of dreams and ideals that black people were thinking about when they finally discover that they can realize their political aspiration independently.
Mark, it's about 50 or is it 60 years after independence. Why are we still talking about extreme poverty, starvation? And there's someone who had put out some statistics here saying that Africa as a continent receives about $50 billion every year through aid. Or you also come from the school of thought that aid is what is even making this continent poorer.
I come from the school of thought, if indeed there is a God, then if there's a continent, he will judge harshly for how she treated her people. It would be Africa, because Africans stand on gold, they are born on diamonds, and oil is basically like water from our taps. We are the most resource-rich continent in the world. The problem is this, that Africa is not in poverty because of the aid we receive. It is in poverty because we lack the self-esteem necessary to take opportunity by the horns and turn it towards our favor. We suffer from what I call low self-esteem. Whenever Africans have a problem, they will go to the West, they will run to China to benchmark how to solve African problems. How will a Chinese tell you how to fix an African problem? How will an American tell you when each of them twisted the laws of their time to fit themselves? If the Americans had not rebelled against the British, they would not have had as great a nation as they do. If the Chinese had not manipulated the economy, they would not be the industrial giants that they are. So we cannot copy the solution of the Americans and the solutions of the Europeans and hope that it works in Africa. The problem with Africa is we lack the self-esteem to dare to dream our own dream and walk our own path. That's the problem. For as long as you cannot form your own destiny, no one can craft it for you. And for as long as that is the case, we will have conflict, we will have poverty, because when you look at the problems of Africa and not have a solution that is African, taking into account our vast cultural differences, taking into account that our nations are still nubile, most of them are under 60 years old. We do not have the character or the patriotism to hold most African countries together. From South Africa all the way to Nigeria, we separate ourselves into our tribes, whether we are Xhosa or we are Nderebo or we are Luya. We are still tribal nations. And as such, we need to realize that reality and ask ourselves, what is the African solution for Africa? For as long as we don't have that, we can receive all the dollars in the world and we will never succeed, because the tribal mind is a selfish mind.
Peter, I'm sure you've heard there, Mark, loud and clear. Let's just make this practical. Just in terms of size, Africa is the size apparently of US, Europe, China, India, and Argentina combined. It's a very big continent. And there are those who are saying that we don't need help. We have capacities, as Mark has already said, we have resources. Do you agree with Mark that we lack self-esteem, or we need some sort of an economic integration?
No, I don't think the problem is self-esteem. I don't believe a bit. We in South Sudan, we have been in the media lately as people that are poor, that have all these refugees, and people are bringing us aid. But I don't think we have low self-esteem in ourselves. I don't think that is where the problem is. The problem is, I think we are sometimes unable to listen to one another and actually agree on what is right to be done. Sometimes we get easily blinded. We are too optimistic. We don't pay attention to details, and we don't really negotiate the right kind of deals, because we do have resources. But if you look, most of the deals that we have, the people that are making money, is not us. The deals are very dumb. If you look in the case of South Sudan now, our oil, essentially we are recovering only 18%. So only 18% of oil is being recovered. The rest is mixed with water because of poor Chinese technology that is really not doing anything. Because of these problems, we are unable to make most of our resources. And then again, there is the problem of inability to build institutions, because we want to have the luxury to decide what is right and what is wrong at each time. We don't want to be held accountable. Is our inability to allow ourselves to be ruled by laws, inability to allow institutions to be built. This is what is allowing African wealth to flee. The story should not even be about aid. It should be about the money that is leaving Africa. In South Sudan alone, now we are very poor. But at some point, we used to generate 400 million per month from oil alone. And that is just only one of our many, many other resources. We were able to generate 400 million per month. So if we use this money wisely, we invested it, we created instrument of accountability, we just submit to the will of our people if we want to serve them, we would have been able to build the best roads, to build the best schools, and be able to create the kind of country that our people fought for. But because our leaders do not want to be held accountable, they want basically to loot resources. They
and I think that's where the problem is.
This is where the problem is.
Yes. Now, Mark, let's finish this debate on a high here. And back in 2016, 5 in 10 economies that grew most in the world are apparently in Africa. There is Ethiopia, Ivory Coast, DRC, Tanzania, as well as Rwanda. They all had a growth rate exceeding 7%. And the observers were saying that Africa is going to have a major global role in coming years. There are also Western economists who are saying that Africa is no longer emerging, it's already here. The future of Africa looks good, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Africa's future is completely bright because, number one, we have the land mass. We have the population on our side. Number two, we have an educated population. It's not just a group of people who are growing. We have got people we've got the highest mobile penetration internet use in the world. We have the highest innovation around mobile phones in the world. We also have the resources which, even after years of plunder, are not yet depleted. And the best part is this, Yusuf, that much of the West is crumbling. They've played their last card, and they need Africa for markets. They need Africa for resources. So all we need to do, all Africa needs to do, is position itself to receive the blessings that are coming its way. And as you've correctly put it, we need to be very careful to choose the leaders who have the kind of vision and discipline to deliver to the next generation the promises that they are making today.
And Peter, as you make your closing remarks, when Mark talks about, Africa has a lot of, resources, has a lot of capacity, I think South Sudan, that can apply also to South Sudan. You've talked about the situation where they have oil and everything. What do you think needs to be done to make sure that South Sudan gets a lasting peace?
What needs to be done is for people of South Sudan to realize that peace will not be brought to them by people from outside. It's not IGAD that is going to bring peace to them. It's them to sit down to determine that their country need to be saved, and it will need to be saved by themselves. They're the one that fought for it. They're the one that shed the blood to create it. Why did they create it? We know the reason why they left Sudan, because they were marginalized. They were not given their right. But why did they create South Sudan? What kind of country did they want to create? Only South Sudanese can answer this. And what we have been doing in South Sudan is to create a space for young people of South Sudan, young leaders of South Sudan, in everywhere we have gone, in Bentiu, in Barghazal, in Taurit, and in Yambio, to sit down and discuss what kind of country do they want, and for them to agree to put down arms. Young people of South Sudan are the ones that can save the country. And they can do so if they put down arms, not allowing themselves to be used by politicians for these percentages to be negotiated, so that they themselves are the ones that say South Sudan as a country must exist, and it must exist because we believe in it. This is what is expected of them.
Yes, yes, Peter, I think that is going to be a final comment. Mark, as you make your closing remarks, let me give you the last word here. And this is a question we did ask our viewers earlier. We did ask them what is their wish for this continent on this Africa Day. What is your wish for this continent? Let me finish with that.
My biggest wish for this continent is that we would realize we need an Africa for all Africans, that we'd open our borders to each other and realize that my brother from West Africa is still the same brother as my brother from South Africa. And in doing that, we will create a common market by which we will have leverage to negotiate with the Europeans and dictate terms upon which we trade with them. We will dictate that the rare earth minerals coming out of Africa will come out on our terms. The gold coming out of Africa will come out on our terms. The tea and the coffee and the farmland, by the way, which they are vastly running out of, but we have plenty in Africa, will only be used on our terms. Only when Africa comes together and is able to put in place the vision of Kwame Nkrumah, Mariam Haile Selassie, and the great founders of independence in this country, including Jomo Kenyatta, to bring us to a point where we as Africans can dictate our space in the global scene, in the global marketplace. That is the day Africa will get dignity. That is the day we will end poverty. That is the day when an American coming to Africa will feel like he's just upgraded his life.
We are all longing to see that day. Many thanks, Mark Bichachi, for your input. Always a pleasure to have you on the show, as well as Peter Biar Jack. Many thanks, Jack, for your input. And earlier, we did ask your viewers, what is your wish for the continent on this Africa Day? Atowino Kotieno gave me about 6 of them. Let me go through them. He says, leadership and governance, common market for Africa, eliminate all colonial vestiges. Africa must develop its economy through its resources, respect, protect, and fulfill all human rights. And finally, says African people must be proud of themselves and live a dignified life. Daniel Buru says, fight corruption, more so Kenya. At Hesbon Masibo says, I wish success to every person striving to earn than stealing. A very, very important message there from Hesbon. At King himself says, cutting corruption ratio. And that's all we had for you. Many thanks for watching. My name is Yusuf Ibrahim. And that's all we had for you on the program tonight. Let me leave you with the proverb of the day. Bye-bye and have a very good night.